protagonists of Italian national history. It's the late 19th century emerging petit bourgeoisie, or lower middle class, made up of country doctors, cattle farmers, lawyers, notables, that emerged, was an important protagonist of life in Italian province, was deeply rooted in a society which remained mostly rural, but had great ambition for social mobility. And the army was, along with the Catholic Church, clergy, and a career in state bureaucracy, was one of the way to pursue a path to social mobility. But Graziani was too poor to afford Accademia Militare di Modena, or the most prestigious military academies in the country, so mass conscription brought him to the army in 1902, when he was 20 years old. From now onwards, his life is, for a while, for the next 20 years, could be that of a man extremely curious and extremely ambitious. He volunteered to live as a junior military officer for Eritrea, which was the recently acquired colony in East Africa, totally peripheral to military life and national political life, but again, a fast path for a quick career in the army. And in that distant colonial outpost, the young Graziani was exposed to the making of Italian colonial society. He studied indigenous languages and he merged within the colonial societies. But he was not the right man in the right place when, in 1911, 1912, Italy declared war on the Ottoman Empire for the conquest of Libya and of the island of the Aegean. Graziani had just got he fell ill with a serious infection of malaria. So this very ambitious young military officer was hospitalized in Massawa and repatriated to Naples while Italian troops were occupying Tripoli. So while what was going on was the finding event and myth of a greater Italy in the Mediterranean, the transition from towards, from a national state, peripheral in the European map, into a colonial power. It's during the First World War that Graziani starts in a way showing his military ambitions but also abilities. He entered the war as a captain in an infantry unit, and he left the war in 1918 as a colonel. He was 38 years old, the youngest colonel in the Italian army. He was decorated for audacious, brave. This is what we read in the official motivation of his multiple medals, for being extremely for showing outstanding skills during blitz, raid, assault on the enemy's trenches. The lesson of the trenches, I think, would reveal central to what Graziani became later and implemented later in Libya and Ethiopia. What he learned as a volunteer in the assault troops in the trenches was not the static war of the infantry soldiers. It was a mobile war of small units, and the surprise attack, the kind of conduct of war that was in violation of that blended at the same time in a horrible conflation the ideology of total war, exterminating the enemy, and the archaism of violence, the corpo a corpo, and the jumping in the enemy's trenches, but also moving across the front. It's the fragmentation of the front line and the collapse of conventional, traditional ideas of how to make war, how to wage war. So when the young Graziani came back to Libya in the early 1920s, he was appointed in a very peripheral outpost. I have a few minutes, or I should very quickly. But I'm already okay. I know the timing is not. So he reorganized the army for a guerrilla-like counterinsurgency warfare in the desert. And this is why Libya was also the laboratory for his political and military career. The concentration camps, the death marches, the mobile columns. So he became, in the 1920s, an iconic figure for the fascist regime, which celebrated officially him as the new fascist man because of the new technique, the innovative methods of total war that made no distinction between civilians and combatants in Libya. 100,000 Libyans were deported and displaced and interned in concentration camps. Half of them died because of epidemics, death marches, physical exhaustion, malnutrition, lack of medical assistance. This was not a side effect, but the planning, what Graziani endorsed as a military leader, the planning of forms of total war. I stop here. And so he left Ethiopia 13 years later, in 1934, for the invasion of Ethiopia. Again, from the south, in appearance, he was appointed in a secondary position, in a marginal task, but he, once again, Graziani implemented what was called innovative, and it was innovative, but it was also criminal, and because it was violating conventions and customary laws of war. He theorized and practiced the use of chemical weapons, the gas that I'm sure we will discuss it more in detail later, and the necessity that to abolish the distinction between civilian and military targets. He wrote a lot, and this is great for historians because he really was a prolific writer. What he theorized extensively was that the new colonial total war aimed not at immediately occupy a new territory, but first at exterminating the enemy, and also preventing national or proto-national elite from organizing a movement of resistance. Is very similar to the argument that the Nazis would implement in Poland during the Second World War. So Graziani, as governor of and as viceroy of Ethiopia, theorized and practiced not only the physical extermination of the rebels, but also young Ethiopians, especially those who had studied abroad, since they were particularly targeted, of the clergy and of the inoffensive, what contemporary international juridical discourse on war crimes define not in terms of the crimes against inoffensive, the civilians that were not just not participating in military operation, but not even preventing military operation from taking place. So Ethiopia, Libya and Ethiopia are the laboratory for techniques of terrorism. The idea that there is a politics of violence. Violence against civilians is planned, is rationalized and implemented in an efficient way, but it's also used as a political means to terrorize the population and discourage resistance. So violence in Ethiopia, as in Libya, and later in the Balkans was exhibited, and also, and I will really finish here, exhibited also in Italy. This is not a violence or crimes that Italians have never heard about. It was part of the celebration of the empire, of the new fascist man, of the making of Italy, its transformation into a new modern colonial power. What happened after 1943 and 45 and the defeat is something that I hope and I wish we will have time to discuss all together later. Thank you.